Hi, everyone. Welcome back. We're just getting set up and we'll start in a minute or two. All right. Welcome to our panelists. Welcome back to our attendees, and welcome to the day's final panel called After Prisons, Abolishing the Carceral State. I'm excited for this conversation. I'm really, really grateful to our panelists for sharing their time and wisdom with us, and to all of you for being here. My name is Cal, and I'm a 2L Toll Public Interest Scholar here at Penn Law, and I'll be moderating the conversation. Before we begin, there's a few housekeeping items that I need to cover. If you have a question during the event, please submit it through the Q&A function. We'll answer questions during the Q&A at the end of the panel discussion. We've been getting really excellent questions all throughout the day, and I'm sure that'll continue during this panel. If you're seeking CLE credit for today's event, please note that the CLE codes will be announced 3 times during the event. Write down these codes and be sure to enter them on your digital evaluation form once the event is over. The evaluation form is mandatory to receive CLE credits. The link to the digital evaluation form was emailed to you in your confirmation email. If you did not receive the email, you can find the link to the evaluation form in the chat. The codes will tell us how long you attended. So the first code is abolition. The first code is abolition, ABOLITION. All right. So although movements for prison and police abolition exploded in visibility and popularity this summer after the police murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, these are not new movements. Abolitionist activists have long agitated for a more just world, one where resources are allocated equitably, harm is less frequent, and accountability is not equated with state-imposed violence. We're very fortunate to have 3 of these activists here with us today. Marilyn Wynn is a co-founder and executive director of Women on the Rise, an Atlanta-based community organization that builds the political power of formerly incarcerated women and advocates for abolitionist reforms to the criminal justice system. In 2013, Wynn received the 9 to 5 Atlanta Working Women's Lilly Ledbetter Award for initiating the Ban the Box campaign, leading Atlanta to become the first city in the South to ban criminal record inquiries on employment applications. And in 2014, she received a letter of recognition from former President Jimmy Carter and First Lady Rosalynn Carter for her work to end employment discrimination against people with prior convictions in Georgia. In 2019, Women on the Rise's #CloseTheJailAtlanta campaign succeeded. Atlanta City Council voted to close the Atlanta City Detention Center and repurpose it as a community resource and support hub. Wynn leads the fight to close the very jail that once incarcerated her. My understanding is that fight is still ongoing, but we'll hear more about it during the panel. Jamelia Morgan is an associate professor of law and Robert D. Glass Scholar at the University of Connecticut School of Law. Her teaching and current scholarship focus on issues at the intersections of race, gender, disability, and criminal law and punishment. Prior to joining the faculty at UConn, Professor Morgan was a civil rights litigator at the Abolitionist Law Center, where she worked to improve prison conditions and end the use of solitary confinement in Pennsylvania state prisons. From 2015 to 2017, Professor Morgan was an Arthur Lyman Fellow with the ACLU National Prison Project, where she focused on the impact of prisons on individuals with physical disabilities. Prior to her fellowship, she served as a law clerk to the Honorable Richard W. Roberts of the United States District Court for the District of Columbia. Professor Morgan is a 2013 graduate of Yale Law School, serves of counsel and as vice president and board member of the Abolitionist Law Center, board member for the Connecticut Fair Housing Center, and as a board member of Mary's Daughter LLC, a nonprofit organization dedicated to meeting the needs of formerly incarcerated women of color. Finally, Crystal Strong is a core organizer with Black Lives Matter Philly and the Black Philly Radical Collective. She is a professor at Penn's Graduate School of Education and is affiliated with anthropology and Africana studies. Dr. Strong's research and teaching focus on student and community activism, global Black youth cultures, and the role of schools as sites of political struggle in Africa and the African diaspora. Some of her current projects focus on African youth leadership, school protests in Africa, and storytelling and archiving Black Philadelphia. With BLM Philly, her work focuses on police and prison abolition, educational justice, and Pan-Africanist solidarity. With the Black Philly Radical Collective, she helps advance the collective's 13 demands for abolition in the city of Philadelphia. She is also co-convener of the Pan-African Activist Solidarity Network and Sunday School, which amplifies Pan-African struggles and connects grassroots activists, through popular education and solidarity work. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm really excited for our conversation. My first question is kind of on the personal side. I once heard Ruth Wilson Gilmore say that she is always becoming an abolitionist. And I really like that. And what I took from it is first that abolition is an ongoing process of liberation that has to evolve and learn. And second, that nobody is born an abolitionist. It takes work and thought to break free of the status quo. So lest people in the audience think that they either are or are not abolitionists, I'm hoping that each of you will tell your story of becoming an abolitionist, if you want, how you're still evolving and struggling in that pursuit, and relatedly, what abolition is and what it means to you. Why don't we start with you, Marilyn?
Okay, so you're absolutely right. We wasn't born abolitionists. My journey started because I am formerly incarcerated. Like you mentioned earlier, my organization is led and ran by formerly incarcerated women of color. Throughout my years of, let me say, I'm back up a little bit. When I first committed an offense that would get me in jail, which I was 17, I ended up going to prison at 18. So I thought that when I came out of prison, I said, I'm never going back there again. I thought when I came out, I would be able to get a job and do all the things of what society said a model citizen is. That didn't happen for me. Actually, that threw my life into a downward spiral where I actually served 7 prison sentences and been arrested maybe close to 41 times, maybe somewhere around in that neighborhood. But I kept trying to figure out how to get out of this cycle, how to get out the cycle. From standing up before a judge, it's really embarrassing, humiliating, and degrading. And every time I stood there, I always wondered, how do I get out of this? But there was always someone telling me, well, plead guilty to this and you can go home. My first thought is, I want to go home. So a lot of things that happened in my life, I really wasn't guilty for, but I pleaded guilty. But then again, when I thought about it, when I bucked the system the last time, when I was about to see myself in prison for the 8th time, I actually just bucked the system and said, no, I'm not going back. I lied to work. I've had 18 jobs. I lied to work, but I never lied to commit a crime. So does this sound like a person that wants to commit crimes? No, it does not. So the judge kind of like said, well, let's have a talk. And I showed him documents. Here in Georgia, you get a statement from Social Security every year just before your birthday showing how many jobs you had since the time you turned a working age up until now. It showed I had 18. So when I told him, I said the gaps are in the middle is when I was terminated from all 18 because I falsified information. So that's how my journey started as to be an abolitionist. I realized that I was fed the same thing, lock up, lock up, lock up. But I used my own journey and realized you cannot lock up the problem. You got to fix the problem. And I was, and as I thought of those things, I said, well, I really don't want to go to jail. I really don't want to shoplift. I don't want to do none of those things. I prefer to be retiring now instead of trying to close a jail now. But that didn't happen for me. And again, that's how I started my journey. I was wondering, start asking everybody, how do you get a job when you got a record? How do you remove this box on the applications? And that's how I started. I just started asking questions because I knew I would die in prison. The system is designed to keep you there. Once you go there for anything, even like the jail that I'm working to close, those people that are in that jail in there for traffic violations, uh, no crime, committing or violating a city ordinance. And some of those people lost jobs, they lost homes, they lost, and once you're arrested, it's hard to get a job because nobody asks, why are you arrested? So that's what led me into the work that I do today, not just closing the system, but finding alternatives to individuals' problems and make sure they get what they need, that they don't repeat the system.
Thank you for that. Jamelia, would you go next?
Hello, everyone. I just want to say greetings to my co-panelists. It's delightful to see you all. Cal, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here, and to the organizers. I think it was so important to at least start the conversation with a focus on the personal, because I do, in my own thinking and study of abolition, think of abolition as abolition as a praxis, both personally and as a scholar. You also indicated in the intro, Cal, that we're all activists. And I just want to say that I consider the term activist to be an honorific, and I don't feel like I've yet earned that. So I would cede that to my co-panelists. It's something that I aspire to be. So to address the question, when was it that I turned to abolition as a study and a personal practice? For me, I went to law. It starts with really going to law school with an understanding that the law causes harm and that there was a role for attorneys in reducing that harm. It was very much an aspiration focused on a harm reduction model of law. And I think, growing up in Southern California, in Los Angeles County, and dealing with the police in the early 90s, I at least had a sense that the law wasn't there to protect Black people, Latinx communities. We were sort of seeing the role of policing and in a very intimate way, right? And so I had always sort of seen the inconsistencies between this aspirational view of law and equality and justice, and wanting, to address that, to reduce the harms that law produces. I went to law school and saw very close how the logics, the operating logics, the carceral logics, the punitive logics that produce a system that's harmful played out. I was fortunate to study critical race theorists who had been contesting the ways in which, even in a moment of racial progress or racial reform, the law was still reproducing racial hierarchy. I was drawn to prison conditions of confinement work in one of the legal clinics that my law school offered as a way to use my law degree to directly address the conditions that in our advocacy and on our thinking amounted to torture, the use of solitary confinement in the maximum security prison in Connecticut. So I knew coming in that the law was an imperfect tool, and yet there was a role for lawyers to play in reducing these harms. And so when I think about the moment in which, or the stage in which I became an abolitionist, it of course was directly tied to my legal advocacy. Working on a case against a large prison system. We were on the winning side of a lawsuit. We were negotiating a settlement agreement. We had achieved a settlement. We had a set of terms, and we were attempting to improve the conditions of confinement for incarcerated people through this settlement agreement. In the course of monitoring and ensuring compliance with the settlement agreement, one of my clients died by suicide. And it was a very traumatic experience for me, in part because it reflected in the most stark and tragic ways the futility in some cases of purely a reform model for legal advocacy, that even in a system-wide class action to improve the conditions of confinement in this particular state correction facility, or prison facility, more accurate, we you could still have a failure of epic proportions, a tragic failure, a loss of life, by focusing in on sort of tinkering around the edges, improving access to medical care and mental health care. Of course, were standing alone important, right, to change the material conditions and experiences of those that were incarcerated there, but that there were such clear limits to that. And I can almost just, kind of thinking back, like remember the moment of just saying, this is not it. This cannot be the full scope of what law can be used for, and my own advocacy as someone that's committed to ending human suffering and human caging. And so I just started reading, and that's literally when I realized that so many of the people, many of that I would identify now as part of the Black radical tradition, I'd been familiar with Angela Davis, but had never quite made the connections to what Davis had so long been writing about. And so that was really the start of my study in thinking about, the ways in which, the response to social harms in society is to lock people up, is to put them in cages. But beyond that, to think about crime as itself a social construction and the logics that lead to that, to the policing of certain bodies and certain minds, and the sort of labeling of those groups as worthy of criminalization, right? And so it's a long process, and I think I'm happy to talk more about, again, the connections between law, the legal system, and the reproduction of subordination, and how abolition sort of is an analysis for breaking down those logics and contesting the state as was lifted earlier. So I'm happy to talk more, but I'll just end there.
That's great. Thanks, Jamelia. And I'm sure that speaks to a lot of people in the audience as law students and lawyers. Crystal?
Thank you so much. It's really wonderful to be here, and I'm so honored to be sharing this panel with two people I admire so much. And thank you so much for convening this space. So I think where I want to start is that, I really appreciated the framing of this question, because I get a little concerned when we frame abolition or abolitionism as like an identity that one is or is not, similar to how everyone's an anti-racist now, right? Everyone's an abolitionist now, and yet the prison and the police are still here. So something's not adding up, right? And so, I really do appreciate what I heard in the previous remarks, which is that, abolition, to the extent that abolitionism and identification with abolition indicates and signals to other people that we don't think this system is redeemable, right? That the only prospect for freedom for Black folks, for, oppressed folks, for poor folks, for, everyone who is crumbled within these systems is to tear it down. Like, that is the point at which abolition becomes a purposeful kind of demarcation. Having said that, though, I think for me, abolition is something I came to identify with later in that particular language. I sort of backed into abolitionism through Black nationalism and Pan-Africanism. And when I think about, there are so many ways that my just formation from childhood has really directed me towards, the way abolition crystallizes, that fundamental irredeemability of the system. Clearly, I can see that my parents, my kin folk, understood that this system is not for us, right? And so, it's very interesting because I grew up right around the corner from Eastern State Penitentiary here in Philadelphia. And, for folks who know of Eastern State Pen, it's the template, the blueprint for the modern prison. And, this is a site that is hulking, right? It looks like a castle when you're a little kid riding your bike around it. But there's something so grotesque now that I think about it, about the kind of like commodification of that space. But I'm thinking with that precisely because I think the lessons of abolition have always been all around me. And, you know, I also think about many of the folks who groomed me within community organizing work, you know, when I was a teenager. You know, I think about, you know, here in Philly, we have such a, and I think this is very common in Black communities around the world and certainly in the US, this kind of like do for self, you know, community empowerment perspective. What I see in that is an understanding that we need another system and structure outside of the one that we are forced to operate within. And so I see within that the ways that it helped me to be very clear about what the goal is here. And similarly, you know, I also just think about the ways that the people I've been able to look up to most and learn from the most within movement spaces. And I'm grateful to have been introduced to just Black organizing work from teenagehood, right? You know, they called themselves revolutionaries, right? They didn't call themselves abolitionists then, but revolution contains within it abolition, right? If we're talking about a true revolutionary horizon, we're talking about, excuse me, tearing some shit down and replacing it with something. And so I'll just sort of close by saying that, you know, I love what abolitionism is doing for us in this moment of, number one, you know, kind of connecting the thread from slavery to, you know, the prison and carcerality, right? And I also love what it is doing for us in illuminating that reform is not going to do what needs to be done for people to be free. But I also, you know, there's a really wonderful short essay that Joy James, who I admire her work so much, it's called Airbrushing Revolution for the Sake of Abolition. And she raises some really powerful points about the kind of like academic taking up of abolition and the commodification of abolition, and how sometimes this language actually it airbrushes, it kind of smooths the edges of what the actual radical revolutionary horizon that we need for people to be free actually is. And so I know I kind of went in a circuitous route there, but I think, you know, where I'm going is that, you know, I think for me, abolition is a way of articulating what, you know, when you are, you know, destroyed by the system, when you are oppressed by the system, you know better than anybody that this is a system that can't be repaired. And so I'm just kind of like thinking about the vernacular version of abolition. And I think I've been surrounded by that my whole life.
Thanks for that. And we'll nail down a little bit later in the panel more on what exactly abolition means and what the movement calls for. First, I want to make sure we touch on police. So at least in my circles, before this summer, when people said abolition, it normally referred to prison abolition. And I think lots of people see them as part and parcel, but you know, if you just said abolition, it usually referred to prison. And I think this summer's uprising after the police murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others, and this fall's protests in Philly after the murder of Walter Wallace Jr., shifted that conversation in kind of the public dialogue towards police. So I'm curious to hear you know your thoughts on police abolition, and especially whether one necessarily entails the other, whether you know prison abolition requires police abolition, and how the conversations are the same and how they're different. If I've given you enough of a breather, Crystal, I'd love to start with you and go in reverse order this time.
Okay, sure. And I mean, my answer is yes. There is no prison abolition without police abolition. There is no police abolition without prison abolition. The police are the foot soldiers of the police state or of the prison state. right? It's almost unfathomable that we would try to disentangle these processes, to me. And I think, there might be rhetorical reasons why we separate them, right? Because the struggle around closing prisons, for example, looks different than the conversation we're having about, targeting city budgets, for example, to defund the police, right? So I think there's like a tactical disaggregation that might need to happen, right? Just because of the way the apparatus of the prison state exists, right? But the short answer for me is there is no, disentangling of the two. And I will say as well that here in Philadelphia, I think we've had a pretty healthy conversation about police abolition, and not necessarily in those terms, for a long time, and certainly before this summer. I think, part of the reason why we went so hard this summer around it is because of the space that was opened with the uprisings. But we've been talking about community control of the police for a long time. My dad, grew up under Rizzo, right? We saw the targeting of the MOVE organization for decades, here in the city of Philadelphia. And so, it's not new in that sense, but I do think, we are able to really put additional pressure around the issue of, around policing. I think it's become less of common sense to presume that, I think it was unfathomable for some people to imagine a world without policing, but I think that conversation is shifting because of the space that has opened up and the way organizers are pushing us to imagine otherwise. But, there's simply no disentangling of this, of the two.
Sure, I'll add to that, those well-said remarks by Crystal. So a couple thoughts. So the first thing, just to think about what the abolitionist future is. And I do think that Ruth Wilson Gilmore captures this, right? To really have an abolitionist future, you need to change one thing, and that is everything. And I think that the threads of these movements, oh, by the way, book coming out, Ruth Wilson Gilmore's book, Change Everything, is coming out in February. Well, we're in February, coming out now, a couple weeks perhaps. Check it out. But I think concretely, I think that when we think about the theoretical underpinnings of abolition, right? So it's in many ways like a way of contesting punishment, at least PIC abolition, punishment as a response to social problems. I think that the evolution of abolition towards discussions around the police recognizes that criminalization is a part of that, right? It is a web of criminalization that now incorporates the police into the practice of punishment, into the practice of sanctioning, into the practice of regulating public spaces. Think about all the roles that the police serve in our society. And I think that we need to think about the evolution of these movements to now have a conversation around policing, in part because the dismantling of the PIC requires an understanding of what role, as Crystal said, the police play as foot soldiers, as frontline implementers, if you will, of the prison system itself. And so I think in my work, I think a lot about disability. I think that because we have failed to invest in systems of care that provide accessible and affordable housing, that provide mental health support services, medical support services, the police are now, in many cases, tasked with responding to whoever is labeled as disorderly or dangerous in public spaces, those in mental health crisis. And they are the catch-all solution to problems. And I think, folks like Critical Resistance have identified this. It's serving a similar function. And then again, if we think about the genealogy of abolitionist theory, the slave patrols function in the same way, the sort of regulating of bodies in public space. I mean, think about the policing of unsheltered communities in the middle of a global pandemic. The street sweeps that continue in cities like Sacramento, parts of Los Angeles, this is the function of police in a society that has not provided social provision for vast numbers of the population and segments of the population, historically marginalized groups, negatively racialized groups. So I think, again, in our own thinking, as individual folks that are organizing in movements or that are thinking about abolition, it makes sense to think broadly about police abolition as well. Now, I will say there's a nuance to that, because so often, and I think this happened too, again, Crystal, as you were mentioning, like the sanitizing of abolitionist ideals and aspirations that happened this summer, defund doesn't necessarily lead to abolition. It can, in many cases, do that, right? Movements have called for defund as a pathway to abolition. But what you saw over the summer was a co-opting of the language of defund, and in a way positioning it as either a radical idea and unfounded, and in many cases not thought through, or in a number of other sort of political moves, you saw Democrats identifying with abolition, but saying it was more about budgets. No, so abolition is not only about the dismantlement of these carceral systems of control of the PIC, of both hard and soft forms of policing and criminalization, but they're also a set of positive projects, right? To use Allegra McLeod's formulation, positive projects that are about investments in new ways of responding to human need, and the provision of care being kind of central to that, not punitive responses. So all that to say, there's a connection in a theoretical sense, and there's a connection in a practical sense.
Yeah, and just to add to that, and I want to say ditto to both things, to Jamelia and to Crystal. And I guess me being the senior seasoned person here, it's been around for years, but we didn't have the space to talk about it or to share it. It's like when I started talking about closing the jail in 2014, they told me, oh no, Miss Marilyn, you can't say that. Miss Marilyn, no, you can't say that. So we stopped saying that. And I just picked up a phrase of starving the beast, which is the prison industrial complex and jails. So by changing policy and getting folks services they need, changing policies that diverted people from jails, divesting from jails and investing in communities. And that's what we did. But by now, with the younger generation, now the space has came where people can talk about defunding the police. We can talk about closing jails and not being criminalized ourselves for saying it. But all of the thing, and you cannot separate one from the other. Police abolition and jail abolition is the same. If you got to reform and retrain police officers, just like Jamelia said, they don't know anything about, they get called out for a person that's having a mental health crisis. They're going to treat that person as though he is a criminal, a worse criminal than any criminal they can think of, because they do not have the training. They don't have the ability to come out to serve that type, that person. And as far as jail abolition is concerned, there are alternatives. Everybody don't need to go in a cage. Actually, I think no one needs to go in a cage. I think people need services. No one asks, why, Marilyn, why did you steal this? Or why did you do this? Or why did you do that? Jail, 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 every time. And while I was there, there was no services for me. So I'm thrown back to the street and back to what I was doing, because that's the only thing that was available for me to do.
Can I add to that really quickly? I really appreciate what you said, Ms. Nguyen, because, I think there, and also Jamelia, I think there is something very important about us naming the co-optation that happened this summer.
Yes.
I got whiplash just seeing how quickly we went from, BLM, abolish the police, defund the police, to let's elect someone who called himself the top cop and the author of the crime bill. Yeah. There is it's almost baffling when you think about how quickly that all happened. But I also think it's indicative of how hollow in many cases the understanding is of what we are actually fighting for here.
Right.
And I do think there is some real work to be done around demonstrating the fact that we can't train and educate a cop to not shoot a Black person.
No, you can't.
Walter Wallace Jr. is someone that the officer who killed him knew very well. Mm-hmm. The police were familiar with his, mental state. They'd come out to his house earlier in that day, right? And we can see, and I think one of the best ways we can see that there's something more than a lack of training here that is happening is you can see someone like Dylan Roof, who killed 8 people at Emmanuel AME, be taken to Burger King. And then we have someone like Walter Wallace Jr., who's gunned down in the street in front of his mother by someone who knew very well what the situation was. And so I think incidents like that, and I do also think there are ways that using these kind of examples itself becomes hollow. It becomes a kind of like opportunistic, rhetoric around like real people's lives, right? But at the same time, I do think there is something really helpful about such stark juxtapositions that show the contradictions, right? And so I think, we have to continue to elevate those contradictions because it shows that, these same rehearsals of the same rhetoric of reform will only get us back to the same place. Right? We continue to have the same conversation. And I think it will never stop the taking of Black folks' lives. Yeah. It will never stop the hypercarcerality of Black people. And then, something I talk about in my work, because a lot of my scholarship, my academic work is out of the United States. But to me, the fact that Walter Wallace Jr.'s, in the uprising around that happened at the same time as NSARS, right? And really showed the contradiction of, we're looking at Nigeria, which is one of I think the most populous Black nation in the world, right? We're not dealing with visible white supremacy like we're dealing with here in the United States. Right. And yet policing is still rooted in militarism, colonialism, the killing of Black people, the protection of private property. So that should tell us that this is the actual function of policing. This is the actual function of the prison. And if we want to remove the effects, we have to uproot the problem. Mm-hmm.
Thanks for that. I told myself I wasn't gonna take notes during this because I was scared that it would impede my moderating, but you guys are making it hard to resist taking some notes. I'm sorry to interrupt this, but I need to make a quick CLE announcement. If you're seeking CLE credit for today's event, please remember to fill out your digital evaluation form and include the CLE codes announced throughout this event. The evaluation form is mandatory to receive CLE credits. The link to the digital evaluation form was emailed to you and will also be in the chat. The second CLE code word is prisons. The second CLE code word is prisons, PRISONS. So Jamelia, a lot of your litigation and scholarship focuses on incarcerated people living with disabilities and the ableism that they face in carceral facilities, as well as the challenges that lawyers face in advocating for them without exacerbating that ableism. I'm hoping you'd talk a little bit about that and that, I think, under-discussed dynamic of the carceral state.
Sure. So in a lot of my work, I'm informed by the principles and praxis of disability justice, which is an abolitionist praxis. And for those that are interested in learning more, Patty Byrne has an excellent list of the central tenets of disability justice and many of the sort of leading thinkers around disability justice, Dustin Gibson, Talila Lewis, Lydia X.Z. Brown, are actively engaging and discussing disability justice, and it's very informative. And I name that in part because I think when you start to work with incarcerated people as an advocate, social worker, what have you, and data of course confirms this, you notice that disproportionately those people that we incarcerate, or communities that we incarcerate, have disabilities. Some are diagnosed, some are not. There are issues with respect to diagnoses in communities of color in particular. So even not having a diagnosis doesn't necessarily mean that one does not have a disability. And so in my role as an advocate, I observed up front that what we have is disproportionate number of people with disabilities in our carceral facilities. Now there's like a complicated story behind that. You know, there are theories like transinstitutionalization that says that, oh, when we closed our large congregate facilities in this movement known as deinstitutionalization, that those individuals were not provided with in-community mental health supports, housing, and social services, as Marilyn noted earlier, and that they too were transferred into jails and prisons. There's data to dispute that. But the point is that what we find ourselves in is one, a divestment from these large congregate facilities without the corresponding investment in community-based services, and a prison system that is filled with individuals that have disabilities. And so the disability justice critique, carceral ableism is one way of thinking about it, points to a recognition that those who we lock up are those that have non-normative body minds that cannot be accommodated in the society that is oppressively focused in on regulating bodies and minds to force them to conform with the norm. There's a lot of theory that goes behind it, but how does it impact my advocacy? When I started studying disability studies and theory and litigating, I saw that there was a disconnect between how those theorists, people with disabilities, writing about disabilities, disabled people of color, Lee Moore comes to mind, and many others, the way they talked about disability was not the way that we talked about disability in our legal pleadings and our briefs. And why was that? It wasn't the individual bias of the attorneys. I don't have any way to know all of the intent behind their actions, but many of the people that I worked with, and I myself was included in the group, we were doing what we thought we needed to do to what? You know, survive a motion to dismiss, win on a legal claim. And what I was finding in my research was that our jurisprudence, like the actual claims that we need to make under the 8th Amendment, and in more recent work, I'm looking under the Americans with Disabilities Act, require this pathologizing of our clients, require to focus in on their inability to deal with the harsh conditions of the prison setting, of the jail setting, not the harshness of the conditions per se. And, you know, we can talk about how low the constitutional floor is, but there was a sense in which the advocacy was centered too much on the individual deficiencies of the plaintiff, of their inability to meet the demands of prison life, to adhere to the prison rules, what have you. And for me, it looked sort of similar to kind of the arguments, again, that critical race theorists made, that law in some ways reproduces social hierarchies and subordinates those labeled as others, in part by constructing these body minds in the carceral space. And so I wanted to, and again, this is again not to suggest any malintent on part of the advocates, but just the way that the law required you to frame your legal injury in order to prevail, right? Or to have a substantial likelihood of success, whatever the particular legal standard is. And so ableism is rampant in the way that prisons are run. Should the goal be to make prisons more accessible so that people get accommodations? That's a part of harm reduction. I think that's so important. There's incredible advocacy going on to ensure that disabled people have their rights under the ADA in prison, or that their constitutional rights under the 8th Amendment are not being violated. And I think like folks like Dylan Rodriguez talk about this, like as an abolitionist, you do have an obligation, duty to respond to urgent human suffering, right? Like we can't just privilege ourselves with just thinking about the theory. But that alone is not enough. And I think if you're a prison rights litigator, you've seen more than the average person, other than those that have family members that are incarcerated. And I think that litigating in an, kind of reform litigation is important. It can save lives, don't get me wrong, but that is not the end of the advocacy, right? That should not be, it's a normative claim, that should not be the end of the advocacy. Because what we're seeing is that making prisons more accessible, ensuring that our disabled clients have all of their accommodations is pretty much just reinforcing and extending the life of the prison system as we know it, when we know that many people are in prison, as Marilyn alluded to earlier, because they didn't get the services that they needed in community. And so that's how I think we should think about both ableism in the carceral space, and obviously, the longstanding critiques of racism that have centered, I think, have really allowed us as not only a movement, but like as the broader public to grasp. But I think we really need to center ableism in our discussions of prisons and prison abolition, the necessity of prison abolition as well.
I really appreciate that. And I think and I'm sure many people here have felt that conflict between kind of the urgency of harm reduction and of reducing suffering in the moment, which can come into conflict with kind of the overall movement towards abolition. And both are so necessary. So to that end, I want to make sure we have enough time to talk about abolition as a practice. That's part of the title of this symposium. Each of you has had lots of experience putting abolition into practice. Marilyn as a lead organizer in Atlanta, Jamelia as a civil rights litigator and board member and scholarship, board member of the Abolitionist Law Center and scholar, and Crystal as an activist and organizer locally here in Philly. So I'm hoping that each of you will talk about how you have put abolitionist principles into practice, how people here can do the same, and especially how to deal with that conflict between improving conditions in the here and now and also trying to avoid further entrenching harmful systems. Why don't we start with you, Marilyn?
Okay, so for the campaigns and that we worked on and to put abolition into practice, as I said earlier, we couldn't name the campaign because I guess it wasn't the time to name it, and it wasn't accepted by society or certain people during that time. But what the way we put it into practice is we started finding low-hanging fruit that we could actually pass laws. And I actually started out with ban the box, but everything that we did was diverting people from jails and institutions into services. And we started with our city of Atlanta has had 81 ordinances on their books that would give the police the opportunity to stop, frisk, arrest, whatever he chooses to want to do. There was like spitting on the sidewalk, jaywalking, standing in one spot too long, they call it an hour and loitering. So all of those nonsense ordinances, we were able to start there. Besides with ban the box, we started there and we were able to get 41 of those 81 ordinances removed from the books. That would divert less people from going to jail. The next thing we did, the city of Atlanta wanted to banish sex workers from the city whom they caught working. And we said, no, that's not happening. People are working to feed their kids. We don't know why they're working, but we do know a lot, they are Atlanta natives, and we weren't gonna let that happen. So what came out of that is we did, the mayor gave us, agreed for us to have a working session. So we took that working session and worked on some legislation, but in the midst of it, he stopped it. So we continued on and we found the LEAD program in Seattle. We liked LEAD program, but all the work we wanted to do was diverting people for jail. No handcuffs, no jail, no arrest, none of that. So we have a program now, it's called Policing Alternative Diversion. Before it was a long name, Pre-Arrest Diversion Initiative. So that organization came out of a campaign, and it is an organization now that has a collaboration with police. If he feels like this person he has arrested this person 2 or 3 times, and he feel that if they had somewhere else to take them, they would do that. So actually they would call someone from that office, from our PAD, so we call it PAD, from PAD's office, and the care navigator and a peer specialist would meet the police, get this person from the police, and the police do his work and paperwork and turn it into the DA's office. We take the person. And it is a harm reduction model. If they're homeless, they become housed that day, not tomorrow, not the next day, but that day. And we don't actually tell them what to do. We let them tell us, what do you need to keep you from the system, or what do you need, period, that will enhance your life and make you become self-sustainable. That person, if they get relapse, they're not out of the program. If they go to jail again, the judge will actually call us and say, come and get your folks. So we started doing that. So from 2015, from 2015 up until now, the jail that we're working to close normally held at least 700 to 800 people a night. There's 19 in there today. There's 19 people in this jail today. So we are working to take the legislation that is holding those 19, or that get those 19 people arrested. We're working now to reclassify that legislation into non-arrestable offenses. And we're fighting with the city because they're talking about some of it can't be non-arrestable offenses. So will it be civil offenses? But when we get through with it, there will not be no one being in that jail. We are working to close and repurpose that jail. So everything we did the like PAD, and after that we did marijuana reclassification. Everything we did diverted people from the jail to the jail is, excuse me, we're damn near empty now. It's 19 people in a jail that holds 1,300 people. So that's what, we do as far as trying to eliminate people from going to jail, first of all, and get them into the services that they need so they can not repeat the system, if that is answering your question.
Yeah, thanks for that. And thanks so much for your work. Crystal, if you would talk a little bit about locally Philly, even more local Penn, if you want, how is abolition being put into practice?
Sure, and I think it's important to kind of frame the ways that this has sort of intensified over time, particularly in light of the 2020 uprisings. I think, prior to that, there have been a lot of different kinds of conversations and different kind of areas of work in which we're seeing some of what Ms. Nguyen was just talking about. For example, we have a community bail fund here. We actually have more than one, but Black Lives Matter Philly was one of the founding organizations for the Philadelphia Community Bail Fund. And that was a part of the whole national Mama's Day bailout from, what was that, 2017, I think. But yes, yeah. But bringing people home and using cash bail as a way of applying pressure, but also getting people home, and also exposing the contradiction of a system that is literally caging people because they're too poor to pay. Not because they've been charged, they've been convicted of anything, but because they simply can't pay. And then there have been other things, like I mentioned, the community control of policing and, cop-free zones, and there have been encampments and, things that I think do really point to an abolitionist horizon and practice in the here and now. But part of what we saw in Philadelphia in, late May when George Floyd was murdered is that there was a lot of just ideological and tactical confusion, right? I mean, uprisings, the kind of openings that they create openings for a lot of things, including confusion, including, de-radicalization, including opportunism. And so we have a very vibrant Black organizing community here in the city of folks who've been doing abolitionist work for a long time. you know, from Move, you know, on up to organizations like BLM Philly, but also, you know, the ALC is a part of that, of the Black Philly Radical Collective, the Philly for Real Justice, a number of folks who've been really a part of this work over the past decade here in the city. And part of what we realized was very important for our practice of abolition in the city is a vision, right? You know, especially in a moment where people are open or listening or even saying abolition, when, you know, a year ago, were people at this level talking about abolition or even defunding? Was this a kind of national conversation that we were having? I don't think so, right? And so part of what we came together and did as a group, a collective of Black radical abolitionist organizations, was to create 13 demands for abolition in the city of Philadelphia as a way of clarifying what abolition is and what it is not, but also communicating that abolition is a process, right? It's not it may not be an overnight type of thing, right? But what are the sincere steps that we can demand in order to get us closer to that abolition? And so if you don't mind, I'd just like to just really quickly run through them, because I think it's important to, you know, without the vision, the practice can be very easily co-opted. And so for us, as, you know, Black abolitionist organizers in the city, you know, we've had to sort of differentiate between some short-term and then longer-term goals. And at the time, you know, the city, and anytime there's a threat of a riot and uprising, you know, people start making concessions. And so it's a very good time to have some clear demands to offer or to push for. And so the first set of them related to an authentic defunding of the budget, because something that the city of Philadelphia tried to do was to simply move something from one tab in the budget to the other and then call that defunding. And so we, you know, demanded authenticity in actual defunding. A stop to the criminalization of Black resistance, right? We saw the tear gassing of 52nd Street here in Philadelphia. You know, even beyond that, with the Walter Wallace uprisings, folks like one of my comrades, Ant Smith, who is now facing federal charges for protest, right? And this is happening to hundreds of people around the country. Hundreds of people were arrested by our supposedly progressive DA. So, you know, really raising the importance of ceasing the criminalization of Black resistance was very important. And also, you know, with that first weekend of uprisings, a huge target for us, and it's been a target for us for years, has been that Frank Rizzo statue that used to be at City Hall, and other symbols of state violence that really become a part of the common sense of why policing is okay, right? In addition to that, you know, we called for the immediate and permanent release of all Black political prisoners. That includes folks like Mumia Abu-Jamal, Russell Maroon Schultz, folks who are elders, who are aging, who were criminalized for doing the same things that we're doing now, right? But are behind those walls and have been for 40, 50 years. And also, in addition to that, releasing all vulnerable people in prisons, right? So decarcerating, especially in the context of this pandemic. We also called for some measures around police accountability as a pathway to abolition. So firing of killer cops, right? And seizing those pensions. Abolishing the Fraternal Order of the Police and the Police Advisory Committee, which we know shore up the police state here in Philadelphia, right? And become a way that accountability is denied. We also called for ending the military occupation of the Black community, right? And the ways that our city police are increasingly militarized, right? If you were here in May and June, you saw National Guard on the streets, right? In addition to that, protection for Black folks in the city. We saw such a disparity during the uprisings between, you know, some parts of the city where, you know, vigilantes were able to carry axes and steel bats with impunity, but folks who are organizing and in protesting, Black folks or folks who are allies, are being tear gassed, right? So really recognizing that disparity. And then finally, you know, ending all carceral systems. This is, of course, a much longer process that includes ICE. It includes, you know, the criminalization of sex work. It includes folks who are trans and overly incarcerated, and also tackling private policing, which includes Penn. This is one of the reasons why we have a campus formation now called Police Free Penn that also has its own set of demands. And then finally, the last demands relate to reparative justice, right? So part of the reason why we also target policing and defunding is because in a city like Philadelphia, they're taking almost $1 billion in resources when kids have to go to schools that have asbestos and lead water, right? So we want our resources, public resources, to be directed to things that actually benefit our community. So we want to fund communities and not cops. And then finally, there is no horizon for abolition that does not include reparative justice. And by reparative justice, I specifically mean reparations. And so that is far, you know, sweeping vision, but it's also, frankly, not even all of the things that will, you know, amount to Black liberation, if that is the ultimate horizon. But we know that focusing on policing and prison and carcerality is a major part of what keeps Black folks and poor folks and all oppressed peoples unfree.
Thanks so much for that. We should be moving into Q&A, but I really would love to hear from Jamelia briefly about what lawyers can do and future lawyers to be in solidarity with abolitionist movements.
Sure, I have a lot to say and I'll keep it brief for sure and invite those that want to learn more to email me. I'm working on a piece now called Abolitionist Lawyers and Abolitionist Lawyering, very much in the tradition of thinking about abolitionist lawyering as a type of movement lawyering, cause lawyering, rebellious lawyering. I think for those of us in the legal field and legal academy, there's a lot of templates for that. One of the things that I want to highlight, just to echo something that Crystal, you just mentioned, but this notion of vision, I do think that's super important. And I think for lawyers, we have to really check ourselves and be clear on what our role is. So are you coming in on assignment from the movements and the communities that you're organizing with? Do you have a particular role to serve that furthers their vision? Or are you inserting yourself without an understanding of the, you know, local history and the demands that this community has? And so I think, you know, at the Abolitionist Law Center Amistad Law Project, there are really good models for thinking about how organizing leads us and what we as lawyers focus in on. There's, you know, lots more to say about that, but I think that situating yourself, checking your privilege, but also recognizing your positionality on a number of different fronts to make sure that you are in alignment with movements to the extent that you want to be engaged in abolitionist lawyering. That is not to suggest that those of us that are aligned with abolition and its goals should not also or could not also engage in harm reduction. I just want to be clear, the specific paradigm. And there's templates. I named a few organizations that are working on decarceration, diversion, decriminalization, and defund movements. Think about all the ways in which law tangles up those liberatory efforts, if you will. And I'd also, since I'm name dropping a lot of abolitionist groups, you know, groups like Civil Rights Corps are very much engaged in these processes of contesting like the criminalization of poverty and getting people out of jail, thousands, along with, you know, Maryland's important work. So thinking about that as a type of abolitionist lawyering, even though perhaps it's not an organization that publicly identifies as abolitionist, they're engaged in that type of practice. The last thing I'll say is the radical imagination. I think Amna Akbar wrote this incredible article called, you know, Toward a Radical Imagination of American Law. If we see law as a part of reproducing these hierarchies, we as lawyers committed to social justice, committed to abolition, need to think about what it looks like to undo those logics, right? To contest them, to challenge crime as a category that's objectively harmful. That doesn't suggest we're not responding to harm, but it means that the labeling of individuals as criminal and the putting of those individuals in cages is no longer a appropriate response to what society has labeled as criminal. It's not a way to respond to harm. It doesn't meet the needs of victims. And Transform Harm, another incredible organizing collective, talks about that better than I can. Okay, I'll stop.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. I think that's really helpful for a lot of people here. Thank you all so much. We're going to move to Q&A in a second. I just have to make the last CLE announcement. If you're seeking CLE credit for today's event, please remember to fill out your digital evaluation form and include the CLE codes announced throughout this event. The evaluation form is mandatory to receive CLE credits. The link to the digital evaluation form was emailed to you, or it'll be in the chat as well. The final CLE code word is liberation. The final word is liberation, Liberation. Okay, I'm going to move to questions. As a reminder, if anybody has questions for our fantastic panelists, you can put them in the Q&A function. The first one I have is about halfway houses. And I think maybe gets to kind of the reformist reforms versus non-reformist reforms and movements towards abolition that people mentioned earlier. Vincent says, halfway houses totally fail the incarcerated in transitioning back to citizenship and employment. Should efforts be made to improve halfway house outcomes, or would that be counterproductive? And should all efforts be put into full abolition? Is it all or nothing? Anybody is welcome to take it.
It might not be satisfying, but I think it has to be both, right? Because the halfway house does provide relief from the carceral space in one sense, but it could also operate under similar carceral logics. It could be ineffective. It could be a pathway right back into prison, and certainly not, it might not set an individual up for success. But again, you know, looking at, let's say like, particular individuals with disabilities. So you might not be able to leave prison unless you have stable, secure housing that provides you with those services, which means you could stay past your maximum sentence date. See, e.g. MG versus Cuomo, a lawsuit brought by Disability Rights New York on that very issue. And so, you know, we have these like interim housing programs that are about reintegrating individuals back into society, to use the language of the state, but if they're ineffective in doing so, that creates sort of like the direct path back into the carceral space. But that alone is not enough. We need stable, secure housing. We need social provision in society. Both of those things can happen at the same time, right? Long-term process.
Yeah. And here in Georgia, you're exactly right. There are women that are sitting in prison right now that are 2 years past their stay because they don't have stable housing, who are considered sex offender women. And the transitional housing here in Georgia is basically like the same as being inside, because the first thing you do or infraction you receive, you go back to the prison system. Like I said earlier about our PAD program, you can't support a person if they make a mistake or something happens and you send them back. You got to continue to work with them. You don't know how long it takes a person to, we call it get well, or be able to comprehend, or whatever it takes for them to become model citizens. You can't put a time frame on how long that takes. And that's what they do. If you know, and they send you right back. So that's not helping, and it's really not helping the women that are sitting there past 2 years past their release date because they don't have a address to go to. So I will put them in the same category as I will put an institution.
Great. A question from Chris is about the tendency to level down carceral policy in the face of racial inequity in treatment. In other words, in the face of a white privileged harm doer like Brock Turner or Dylan Roof, many call for harsher, more punitive policies, think mandatory minimums, rather than leveling up by treating Black people ensnared in the system with more humanity. Any thoughts on addressing that tendency?
You know, I would say it's a tension that has been addressed. I remember Andrea Ritchie and Mariam Kaba wrote something, I think in June, in Essence magazine, talking about calls to prosecute the police that killed Breonna Taylor. I note the tension because I think, you know, abolitionist purists could say, well, you know, that's completely asinine to call, you know, for the prosecution. And that's not abolitionist, right? Calling to prosecute the police, you know, would reinvest resources back into the state. And I think, as the questioner notes, operates off the same carceral logics, punitive logics, that's the way to get justice, right? But we have to understand where that comes from too, right? So I think that their piece really captures the nuance of it, like not just wagging our finger at those that call for those accounts, understanding that that's situated in a system, in a country that has underprotected Black people for so long, that it makes sense to aspire to at least want to live in a society that, you know, as Dr. King says, you know, remains true to what it said on paper. But that's not abolitionist, right? And so I think we have to recognize the nuance, not necessarily condemn those that call for it, but distinguish that. And I think Kaba and Richie do that, right? Not abolitionist, understandable, but we want something more. That is not justice, right? At least that's the argument. Prosecuting police is not justice. That does not get at the heart of what was a tragic loss of the life of Breonna Taylor.
And I think what I would add to that, and I appreciate you jumping in there, because I think this issue is one of the more divisive issues within just like abolitionist circles, whether you're coming at it from the legal profession or you're an organizer. I think, and it really gets at the heart of the challenge that abolition poses to us, which is, can we remove the cop from our own head, right? Like, can we imagine and strive to be in a different kind of relationship with each other that doesn't deepen harm, right? And, you know, I think Jamelia is exactly right. And, you know, calling in, you know, Richie and Kaba in particular, because the challenge or the problem is when we think that is abolitionist, and it's not, right? Like, let's just be clear that it's not, right? But then the other piece I would say too, that I think is also important to recognize, the amount of effort and energy that it takes to pursue that kind of demand around, you know, the firing of the cop, you know, their indictment, you know, you should throw the book at Dylan Roof, all of these things, they're actually de-radicalizing in most cases. They suck all of the energy out of the room, especially because they're usually not successful, right? In terms of cops who've been quote unquote held accountable by the same system, they're very few and far in between. And so when we direct our attention towards that one small piece of this large system, not only is it not abolitionist, but we're sapping our own energy when we do that. And so I think that's another piece that's more than the ideological side of it, but also just like, I mean, I'm sure you've all seen it. You know, we keep demanding the accountability, like we do the protest at the courthouse, we do it, and it really, it distracts us from our actual goals. And I think that's the part of it that doesn't get mentioned all of the time, how demoralizing it is when they're inevitably not punished. And so if we had stayed the course, you know, perhaps we could have stayed on course with what the larger goals are.
We have 1 minute left, and as much as I would love to ask one of or both of these remaining excellent questions, I think it would be malpractice to do that and expect that we could get any real answers in. So instead, I'm just going to extend a really, really genuine and heartfelt thank you to our panelists. This has been a really excellent conversation and a really great capstone to a day-long symposium and I guess a week-long public interest week. So thank you all so much for being here, and the very best of luck in everything that you're doing.
All right, thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Oh no, I did say the last code word. I'm sorry. I was scared I forgot to say the last code word.
Okay, that wraps up our day. Thank you so much to everyone who has been with us all day. They can come in and out. It's been honestly a really incredible day. I've learned so much. I am honestly a little exhausted given the amount of information that I feel like I have absorbed throughout the day. But I also at the same time feel incredibly energized just from all of the lessons that I've learned. I jotted down a couple of things that I just wanted to share with y'all. So this morning we started off, for those who've been with us all day, with our keynote speaker, Josie Duffy Rice, where I learned about and was encouraged to think about a new future, and reminded that when you rely on the system to police the system, you will often fall short, and that we have. And then our next panel on about abolitionist frameworks for housing justice, I was reminded of the work of local organizers to address the growing housing crisis and encouraged to imagine a world where housing stability was the norm. In our family surveillance, the Future Without Foster Care panel, we heard how the carceral state is tied to family regulation, and learned about a system that says it wants to protect our children, yet instead seems to destroy families. In our Abolishing ICE panel, I learned about the harms of detention centers and our many current immigration policies, and imagined how to stop these harms from continuing. And then finally, just now, I learned so much but in our Abolishing the Carceral State, in particular, I learned about abolition is more about simply just defunding the carceral state, but it's more about investing in new ways to meet community needs. So to wrap up, again, we want to just thank all our incredible panelists, many of you still see on the screen, and our keynote speaker, Josie Duffy Rice. And then a huge, huge, huge shout out to our T-Pickles, as they are often known. You can see Kelsey there, and then we have Victoria and Kanisha. Thank you so much for all of your continued support. Truly, this would actually not be possible without them. I wish we could give them a huge round of applause. And so just to say, I personally feel so privileged that I've had the opportunity to share this virtual space with so many inspiring people who dare to dream about creating a better world. If you'd like to keep up the conversation and learn more, we've linked the program in the chat box, and there's a section about continuing. So go learn, explore, and there's been a lot of other resources throughout the day. So as a final bye, we're going to invite everyone to do a little bit of participation. So I'm hoping that in the chat function, we're opening it up so you can chat the panelists. If everyone could just put one word, it can be a feeling, a lesson, something that you took away from today, and I will read some of them out loud. So I'm getting grateful, challenged, inspired, another inspired. We're feeling a lot of inspiration. Thinking bigger is 2 words, I'll take it. Bold, liberating. I love this energy. We have lots of work to do. Again, more than 1 word, but I'll take it. Abolition is love. Energized. I wish you guys could feel my energy here. I'm trying to emanate it through the screen. Another energized, community, fight. These are incredible. I wish we could make a big word blurb. Fab, empowered, mind expanding, imagination, collective. This is incredible. Thank you again so much. I don't have anything else to say other than I just feel like I wish I could hug everyone. It's like one big hug is what Kanisha mentioned with all of us on the screen. But thank you to everyone who stayed on all day. We had at some one point almost 300 people attending. It's been an incredible, incredible day.